Welcome to the Festival of Storytellers. I thank everybody that's involved with this process because we know writers need readers and writers need publishers.
Experience is not about the publisher, it is about us, the authors.
Good evening, everybody who is out there. It's kind of sad that you can see me, but I can't see you. But I am your storyteller for the evening. And the story I'm going to tell is not really my story, but it happens to be the story of my parents. This is my book. It's called Letters from World War II. These are my parents, and you can see my dad is in his Air Force uniform, and this is my mom. This is their wedding picture from January 19th, 1943. So this story is a story that I have to tell you I did not know. My parents were just an ordinary couple who got caught up in the events of World War II, and extraordinary things happened to them. And, oh, hi, Mr. McBride. Anyway, extraordinary things happened to my parents. And what's interesting is that it's a story that my sisters and I never knew. Because my parents, like a lot of World War II parents, once they came home from the war, they put everything behind them and went on with their lives, and they never talked about their experiences. It was just something that happened out of their minds. And growing up, my sisters and I did not know the story, and I don't think that was unusual. We knew some things about the war. I mean, this picture of my parents sat on our dining room buffet their entire lives. And we'd look at it and my dad would point out, these are my wings as a navigator. So the story that came out is one, as I said, my sisters and I did not know. So this story takes place from 1941 to 1945, the World War II years. And during that time, during those 4 years, my parents only spent about 3 weeks together. The rest of the time they were separated. But what their whole relationship evolved through were their letters. They were prolific letter writers. And they wrote about all of their experiences wherever they were to each other. And that kind of is how I told the story of what happened. So this book is a story of what happened to them especially what happened to my dad during World War II. And it is a bit of a love story. It's very historic because of the events that affected my dad. And it's a bit of a mystery to find out what exactly happened to my dad and how he got home. And it's a story my sisters and I had to put together because we didn't know. I will say that growing up, we knew a few things about World War II, and we knew a few things about them. The biggest thing that we knew was that our family celebrated Jump Day every January 11th, our whole lives, Jump Day. My dad would come down to the kitchen from upstairs and he'd look at us who were trying to figure out what to have for breakfast. And he would go, "It's Jump Day. Let's have pancakes." And he would make pancakes for us on January 11th, year after year after year. In fact, when I came home after I had gone to college and I came home for my first winter break, January 11th, my dad down from upstairs, "It's Jump Day. Let's have pancakes." So what we knew as young kids about Jump Day was simply that our dad jumped out of a plane with a parachute. He jumped out of this plane. It was winter and he landed in the snow. He took off his parachute, and then he and the other guys from the plane started walking through the snow. And they were picked up by what my dad called were the German police. And he went to prison camp, not prison camp. And when we asked him about prison camp, he said, well, we lived in cabins and we slept on bunk beds. Sometimes we cooked our food outside. We played lots of games, card games. We had baseball teams. To a bunch of young kids, doesn't that sound a lot like summer camp? So in our minds, growing up, our dad jumped out of a plane. He was in a prison camp for a summer, or we didn't really know. As young kids, we didn't know why he was on a plane. We didn't know why he had to jump out of the plane. We didn't know who these German police were. You know, growing up, we were told by our dad, if you ever were in trouble, find a policeman good. So growing up, we never had a sense that there was anything bad. So my dad was not drafted. My dad enlisted, and the game with enlistment, I'm answering Shannon's question here. The game with enlistment, which I got from one of his letters, he was writing my mother saying, you know, my draft number is number 483. I'm thinking I'll get called up in May, maybe early June. He's trying to decide whether to enlist or not. If you enlisted during World War II, you might get a chance at choosing which branch to go into. If you didn't, you were just drafted and probably went into the Army. But my dad enlisted and got into the Army Air Corps. And he spent a year at Geiger Field as a corporal and then as a sergeant, and then Pearl Harbor happened, and my dad was a lot like other soldiers who may have gone in just trying to do their 18 months, but Pearl Harbor affected a lot of people, and my dad wrote a letter. Remember, this is letters from World War II. He wrote a lengthy letter to my mother about Pearl Harbor, and he felt that he should do something more than just be a sergeant. So he applied for flight school. My dad, like a lot of guys, wanted to go to flight school and be a pilot and, chase after Japanese subs, tussle with the Luftwaffe. He wanted to be a pilot. And when he went to Santa Ana, where they determined by testing which you would end up as, meaning a pilot, a navigator, a bombardier, the commissioned officers in a B-17, not everybody could be a pilot. And my dad wrote a letter to my mother that said, I missed pilot. I'm going to navigator school. Well, I did a lot of research about navigation school, and my dad was a math whiz. In fact, he met my mother in high school. He met my mother in high school, and he did her geometry for her. So my dad kept taking these tests at Santa Ana, and he kept passing all the math tests. And the Air Force figured out in 1943 that they could not send these bombers, especially strategic bombing over Germany, without a navigator, because bombers got lost. They couldn't get back. They couldn't find their targets. They needed a dedicated navigator on each plane. And so my dad was selected as a navigator. And actually, he came to recognize how important it was being a navigator. So the initial, I'm not going to be a pilot, to understanding how important it was being a navigator. So he was a navigator, and he told us growing up that, so my sisters and I, growing up, he taught us to use slide rules. He taught us map reading. We understood that what he did as a navigator. So he was a navigator on a B-17, got his commission. My parents were married on June 19th, 1943, and in August, he flew off to England, and he made it 16 missions. He was in the 381st Bomb Group, 533rd Squadron, stationed at Ridgewell Air Base, and he made it 16 missions and was shot down on his 16th mission. I found the macro report. Every plane that went down in World War II, they published a macro report, MACR, missing air crew. And they're all in the National Archives, and I wrote for it to find out exactly what happened to my dad's plane. And so he went down on his 16th mission. He was captured by the Germans, and he was in German prison camp. Growing up, we knew that he was in this prison camp. For some reason in my head, I thought he was just there for a summer, but he was there for 16 months. And he was there for 16 months. And then where his camp was in northern Germany, Barth, Germany, clear up on the Baltic Sea, this, of course, was Russian territory, Russian airspace, Russian territory. It became part of East Germany, and it was quite dicey, these 8,000 POWs that were at Stalag Luft 1, how they got out of there and how they were rescued. It almost didn't happen. I had no idea. One of the interesting things is we didn't know this story about my dad and at all. When my mother died, we found these two boxes in the back of our bedroom closet. We thought we knew everything that was in this house, but there were two boxes. One of them was a cardboard box with a top, and it was stashed full of letters, unbelievable letters. When I found the box, I picked up a packet, and it said Ridgewell Air Base, Essex, England. I picked up another packet, and they were really funny looking. They had German all over the front of them, Mit Luftposte, Stalag Luft 1, in my dad's name. And they were not in envelopes. They kind of folded like this, and so that the Germans, of course, could open them and censor them. But the one box contained all these letters. And then there was another box. It was wooden, and it had a heavy wooden top. And I pulled the top off, and it was crammed to the top, full of documents, all these documents. I pawed through it for a couple of minutes, and I'll tell you what caught my eye were French francs. There were a number of French francs in this box in German Reichsmarks. And I looked at these French francs, and I said to my sister, wait a minute, when was Dad in France? What was he doing in France? How did he get to France? he was in a German prison camp. What was he doing in France? So what happened was I took these boxes to my house with the idea that when I retired, I would read the letters, go through the papers, and it'd be a good project. And then COVID hit. And one morning I got up, made a big pot of coffee, and I opened the document boxes first. And probably within 15 minutes, I was stunned at what I saw. The very first thing I picked up out of this wooden box was a Western Union telegram to my mother. And knowing Jump Day was January 11th, although I didn't know what year, 44, 45, I had no idea. This telegram was dated January 26th, 1944. And it was addressed to my mother, and it said, had 2 gold stars. A telegram in World War II with 2 gold stars meant it was from the War Department. So I read it, and it said, the Secretary of War regrets to inform you that your husband, Lieutenant Hannon, has been missing over Germany since January 11th. And I thought, it's dated January 26th. My mother didn't know for 2 weeks that he was even missing. And I hunted through the box, and I found a second telegram with 2 gold stars, and it was dated February 17th. And it said, the Secretary of War would like to inform you that your husband has been reported as a prisoner of war of the Germans by the International Red Cross. So my mother did not know for 37 days that my dad was missing, whether he was dead or whether he was alive. I looked at those 2 telegrams, and I suddenly thought about my mother for 37 days. She was teaching high school at the time, so she had to get up every day, take this long bus ride to go teach, come home, look for the mail. 37 days. My mother did not know whether he was dead or alive. And then I found a third telegram, and it was April 17th, 1944. And it said, the Secretary of War would like to inform you that your husband is a prisoner of the Germans at Stalag Luft 1. His POW number is 2172. You may write to him at this address. So then I hunt through all these letters, and I found a letter to him dated April 17th. My mother got that telegram, and she immediately wrote him. And the letter was, it was just an unbelievable letter. Dear George, I'm so happy to find out you're okay. I'm okay. I love you. Stay strong. We'll see each other soon. Well, that was April 17th. It'd be another year from the date of that letter until June of 1945 that my mother would actually see him. But I thought about my mother, and even though she knew now, finally by April, he was safe, I thought about my mother in those 37 days, even knowing that he was a prisoner of the Germans at this prison camp. It was winter, knowing my mother. It's cold. Does he have warm clothes? Does he have food? Does he have medical care? Is he injured? She did not get anything from my dad until May. I believe it was May 25th. And it was just this little card. It was this big. And it said, Dear Dorothy, I am in a permanent prison camp. I am not injured in any way. See you when the show is over. Love, George. That's all she got in May. So January, February, March, April, May, and she got that little card. And she wrote him a letter back after receiving that card that said she was so happy to get this card. And she wrote him that she took her finger and she traced his words on this card. and wrote to him and said it was almost like touching your hand. So these letters that my parents wrote were stunning. They were stunning in that not anywhere in these over 80 letters from each other on all this horrible stuff that was going on, is there any word of anger? Is there any word of rage? There's nothing in these letters like, poor us, why did this happen? That happened to us, and this is horrible. Nothing, just these positive letters trying to keep each other's spirits up. My dad is writing to my mother, telling her that he has food and he's becoming a good cook, and they're cooking and they get these Red Cross boxes, and that he's okay. You know, my mother is writing to him, you know, keep your spirits up, George. I have such plans for us when you get home, and I think about you every day. And people stop me and tell me how great it is that you're safe in a prison camp. I mean, my mother just wrote these very chatty letters. The most poignant letters they wrote to each other were always Christmas Eve. Christmas Eve, my dad would write my mother would write my dad, no matter where they were. And the letters were the same. Dear darling, in my heart, I know this is our last year apart, and then we'll be together for every Christmas after this for as long as we have. Of course, these letters, you know, there was another year and another year that went by. So I used the letters to kind of tell the story. But I will tell you right now, if any of you write a book, the research to figure out what happened to my dad, what life was like in England, what it was like navigating a B-17 bomber, where this prison camp was. This prison camp, Stalag Luft 1, there were a number of reports that you can get from the National Archives where Red Cross was allowed to visit this camp and talk about the conditions. At the end of the war, there were stunning treatises written about Stalag Luft 1. And so I started doing the research. I started with my dad's bomb group in England, because my dad, when he first got to England, wrote these incredible letters to my mom. He was excited when he was first there. He wrote a letter about going to London, and we saw Buckingham Palace and Westminster Abbey, and there's things that are really old over here. And we went to Piccadilly Square, these letters. But as time went on in England, my dad's letters get a little darker. You can tell that he is clearly scared. He writes, it gets harder and harder every day to get up in the plane because you don't know what's going to happen, and your life hangs in the balance until you see the coast of England again. And then in this letter, my dad wrote, but I signed up for this job and I will do it to the best of my ability, no matter what happens. My dad's commitment to this whole horrible thing was stunning. Never a word of giving up, nothing. He just kept saying, I will do it to the best of my ability, regardless of what happens. So I did a little reading about the 8th Air Force in England in World War II. When my dad was flying in 1943 and early 1944, that was long before the 8th Air Force had control of the skies over Germany. They were getting slaughtered at the time my dad was there. And my dad, although he probably didn't know, had about a 1 in 4 chance of getting to 25 missions. 1 in 4, a 25% chance. If you jumped out of an airplane in the middle of combat, in the middle of, you know, German fighter pilots flying around in flak everywhere and planes exploding, you only had about a 60% chance of reaching the ground in your parachute. It was, the 8th Air Force lost more men during World War II than the Marines and the Army. It was a slaughterhouse until, and my dad, what a hero. My dad got up every day and got in that plane, flak everywhere, being shot at, being chased by these German fighter pilots. And then he bails out and gets to this German prison camp. So I desperately wanted to know about this prison camp. And I had no idea. In this box of stuff, all these documents, there were medical records, you guys. There was a medical record for my dad when he arrived at Santa Ana Air Base, and he weighed 165 pounds and was 5'5". When, after the war, when he was at Camp Lucky Strike in France, he had a medical exam. This is after they were rescued from this prison camp. My dad's weight was 131. My dad lost 34 pounds, probably more. There was a notation in his medical record that he would need all of his teeth pulled and dentures due to malnutrition that rotted his teeth. So I was stunned. I had no idea how awful this prison camp was. I then did a lot of research to find out how my dad got to France and was rescued out of this prison camp clear up in the Baltic. There were 8,000 8th Air Force commissioned officers at this camp and about 1,500 RAF at this camp. And they were just isolated up here on the Baltic. And the story of how they were rescued and got out of there is a stunning story. It's really well documented, but I think people don't know much about it. So after I found out, I was pretty stunned at how he got out of there and what was going on just before the end of the war with the Russians, with the Germans. It is a stunning story. If you want to find out how he got out and was rescued, you got to read the book. But after I put this story together, after I read these letters, I really felt the need to tell their story. These are just two ordinary Americans, just young, and extraordinary things happened. And the way they behaved and dealt with this separation, this sacrifice, was stunning, in my opinion. With their positive outlook and letters, positive, they would see each other again. My mother wrote in one of her letters, "Darling, you wait there and I'll wait here. And someday we will be together and never have to wait anymore." And I thought, my God, people today, I think, don't understand the kind of sacrifice of this generation. So I wrote the book, number one, because I needed to know the story. Number two, I wrote it for their children and grandchildren. And number three, I wrote it for anybody who might pick it up. And we cannot forget this generation and what they did. And the one interesting thing I said to one of my sisters is that I spent over a year putting this story together, getting documents. I went to the air base in England, got on a plane, went to the air base in England, talked to the curator of the museum, learned all about the 381st Bomb Group and what life was like for them there. Then I got on a plane and I went to Bark, Germany, where the prison camp was. I had to stand where this prison camp was. Nothing's been built there. It was bulldozed down, but I had to stand there where my dad spent these miserable 16 months. And after I put this whole story together, I said to one of my sisters, all I would have had to do is ask mom or dad what happened. But again, had no idea. So anybody who has a story like this, I would encourage you to put it in a book, tell your story. For me, I just don't want anybody to forget what my parents did. So thanks very much for listening to me. I get a little emotional sometimes talking about my parents, but I think it's really important to keep their story alive, which is what I tried to do. So thanks, everybody.